Hello, my friends. It's Sarah, the Tudor travel guide here. Delighted to be back with you and to guide you through our next Tudor adventure together. I was really excited to head down to Sussex and to visit the Weald and Downland Museum. It's a museum that I've heard so much about and was so keen to visit because I very often get emails from people or messages on social media saying, I love learning about the aristocrats and the palaces, but what about the ordinary Tudor people? Tell me more about the ordinary Tudor people and the places in which they lived. Well, there's no finer place to do that than the Weald and Downland Museum. Now, I will let our guide today, John Roberts, tell you all about the museum and its purpose and what you can hope to find there. In this particular podcast, you're going to be finding out all about a typical medieval hall house. That's H-A-L-L. I didn't want any ambiguity in there. From our guide. Now, a hall house was first built during the medieval period, but it was a typical kind of house that persisted into the 16th century, so is very much relevant to our period. And you'll be hearing about the house, its construction, about the spaces and how it was used, and the kind, the level and the status of the person who would have owned such a house. So strap yourself in, my friends, because we're about to go time travelling, and we're travelling right into the heart of ordinary Tudor England. So hello everyone, welcome to the Weald and Downland Museum. This is my first time here, so as you can imagine I'm incredibly excited to be here because it's a place I have wanted to come to for such a long time, not least because it's just full of gorgeous historic buildings, medieval Tudor buildings and others, but of course our attention as ever will be on some of the Tudor buildings that are here at the museum. Now, the Weald and Downland Museum is in a part of England, southern England, called Downland. It's close to the South Downs, and it's a beautiful area of the countryside, full of glorious rolling hills and dotted with woodland and copses and other kind of open bracken land. It's a really beautiful place. So I am now joined by our very special guest for today. Hello, John. Welcome to the Tudor History and Travel Show.
Hi, Sarah.
So, thank you for joining us today and being our guide in this fantastic museum. I just say for those people listening in, you may hear some sound of wind in the background because I think we've picked a morning where there's a howling gale going on, but thankfully the sun is out. So, John, before we get into talking about these amazing places, maybe you could just introduce yourself and tell us what you do here.
Yes, my name's John Roberts and my job title is Rural Life Interpreter. So I have to explain to the visitors the working life of the countryside over the past, for about 1,000 years.
Oh,
from
wow.
late Saxon through to the early 20th century.
Oh gosh, so you really do have to cover a huge period of history. But we're going to get you to focus in on quite a narrow part of that history, of course, Tudor history today. So you've been here, you were telling me before we hit the record button, you've been here for 35 years?
That's right, yes.
Wow, so what you don't know about this place, I guess is not worth knowing.
Oh, you're still learning all the time, and history moves on as interpretations change and more evidence comes to light.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, before we start exploring some of the buildings, maybe you could just tell us about the museum, what it is, how you describe it, how it came into being, and what it's here for.
Well, it first opened in 1970, but had been founded 5 years before that. And it was founded as a last refuge for vernacular, ordinary people's buildings, not just houses, but workshops and farm buildings. Because in the wake of post-war redevelopment, with lots of bits of the country having been knocked down and an ageing building stock, the buildings of the ordinary people were being swept away with new town development and the like. And a chap called Roy Armstrong, with a group of volunteers that he'd been working with Workers' Educational Association and the Weald and Building Study Group, realised that there was actually a prospect that all of these buildings could be lost. And he wanted to save a few examples. So all the buildings that we take here They have to have no future on their original site,
Right.
because Roy believed that they lost 99% of their story once you moved them. They have to be something we don't have to have an example of already, and also they have to be from the Weald and Downland area.
Okay, so all local to here. And the museum itself, what area does it cover, and how many buildings do you have on site roughly?
It covers about 50 acres, and we've got above 50 structures now,
Okay.
but they range from quite small.
Ah, yes, we've passed a few of those little, what would you call some of the smaller places?
Well, we've got workshops and cattle sheds and living vans.
And up to the grander buildings, which would have been what, merchants' houses, or how would you describe those?
Well, Bayleaf House, which we're going to talk about, is probably about as high up the social scale as we go.
Okay, right.
So the top of the peasantry.
The top of the peasantry. And I know there are many of you out there who email me regularly and ask me about, what was ordinary Tudor life like. So I was really keen to come down here, and that's what we're going to be exploring today. So I think maybe we should take a look at our first building.
Okay, yeah.
So John, you've brought me up from the sort of the ticket area through part of the museum, and we've arrived at what I would describe as a timber-framed kind of wattle and daub house called Bayleaf Farm. Now, is that a reasonable description for this building?
It is, yes. This is a medieval timber-framed hall house, which may seem odd as you want to talk about the Tudors, but this is how it looked at the beginning of the 1500s.
Right, so just as we're, and I think you were also saying that this is the kind of house that would have continued through the Tudor period, so it would be typical of its type through that era, through the 16th century as well?
Yes, how ordinary people design their houses changes through the 1500s and into the early 1600s. And these changes are pushed by economic changes, social changes, not just technology, which is how a modern person always wants to see all change.
Okay, well maybe you could describe a little bit about that. First of all, just describe for us what we can actually see, and then maybe you could talk a little bit about those changes and how houses developed from the sort of the 15th through to the end of the 16th century.
Right, well, what we have in front of us is about the best lifestyle you could probably hope for as anyone below gentry level. This is a yeoman farmer's house, but it is a classic late medieval building. It has an open hall in the centre, open because there is no first floor.
Yep.
And your heating system is a fire not quite in the middle of the floor. So you need that space to let your smoke disperse. Then at either end, you do have an upper floor.
Yes, I can see that.
And this particular building, which is a type called a Wealden, it is jettied, it projects over the front.
And is there a reason for that? Is that just to make the upper floor space bigger, or was there another reason why that was built in that fashion?
Well, we have to post-rationalise a bit here, which is always a dangerous thing to do. We think jettying did develop in towns where you had a restricted building site and you could gain more floor area by extending over the street. But the tenant living in this building had a very large farm. If he wanted more floor area, he could have just made the whole house bigger. So we think it's status.
Oh, so just like a really nice architectural feature that says something about, look,
Yes.
I can have these wonderful kind of wooden beams and so on projecting from the house.
Yes, and we think that's our view of this is reinforced by the fact that it's jettied at the front and it's jettied at one end but not the other.
Oh,
And the end that it's jettied was the end that pointed towards the track that went by it.
the street where
Yes.
it would be seen by the passers-by. Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. Now, do you know who lived here? Do we have any records of its history, this particular building?
Well, finding records for vernacular buildings of the ordinary people, is haphazard, really. You have to strike lucky, and we are quite lucky with this house because it had a name. Now, we call it Bayleaf House. It's a corruption of its original name because we think it was built either by or for a chap called Henry Bailey, somewhere between about 1405 and 1430.
Right.
So it was Bailey's house.
I see, yeah.
And then over time, it's been corrupted to Bayleaf. and you find it spelt all sorts of different ways in documents.
And so he was a farmer, essentially.
We know very little about him because, from what we can tell, he died soon after the house was built. And we only start to know, we know who lived in here throughout this period, but we only start to know a lot about the families from about the 1560s onwards.
I see. And what about the later family? What do we know of them? I'm just so curious because, you know, it's the people who live here that bring these buildings to life, isn't it? There's the stories that I think you talked about before.
Well, it was lived in by a chap called Thomas Wells. And in documents, he's described in 3 different ways in different documents. He's described as a yeoman, a carpenter, and a farmer.
Is that unusual? Because they seem like quite different occupations to me.
Well, yeoman sort of shows his place in society. It's not a class because our class system doesn't really develop until the 1700s as we understand it.
Right.
But there are a particular level of tenant farmers right at the top.
Okay, and actually, look, while we're here, there will be a lot of people listening to this who don't know what kind of levels of Tudor society, you know, can you describe them right down from the peasants upwards? Can you give us a feel for particularly the so-called ordinary folk, not necessarily the aristocratic classes?
Well, the late Tudors are actually starting to write down descriptions of how society is divided up. So at the very top, you have the aristocracy, who are the super rich of their day, mostly. Then below them is the gentry. And the key elements of both these sections of society is they own land, they own the freehold to land. Below that, you are generally renting your land, you're a tenant.
Right.
And the key thing about being gentry is you make your money from rents, not from the sweat of your brow. Yes,
I get it.
But within every section of this society, there are different levels of this. So at the very bottom are the criminals, the insane. Then you've got what later sort of get called the deserving poor, who are sort of destitute for no fault of their own. Then the labourers, then husbandmen, which we might term as smallholders or subsistence farmers, who probably also supplement their income by labouring for people like the tenants of Bayleaf.
I see. So this guy would be renting his land. Did he then sublet it then to the husbandmen, for example? How did they rent their land?
No, he didn't. Often husbandmen are renting directly from the landowner. Subletting does occur a lot, and it gets more and more common, and it makes a nightmare of trying to pick out who's actually living in somewhere. But strictly speaking, it wasn't legal.
Okay, right.
Most landlords.
Now, I'm aware that about 5-10 minutes ago, I asked you a question about how houses evolved from the 15th to the 16th century, and you started beautifully to describe what we see in front of us now. But could you then just forward wind that story and talk about how kind of ordinary houses developed and why they did so?
I can try.
Okay, go for it.
It's still a contentious issue.
Okay.
But what happens, probably for most ordinary people, from about the middle of the 1500s onwards, is they start to change their house design. And the biggest innovation, we'll call it, is putting in a chimney. And once you install a chimney, you can have a first floor all the way across, because you don't need that open space to let the fire, smoke from the fire disperse.
It's so obvious when you say it, John.
And you lose the big central room, the hall, but it enables you to have more rooms. So rooms tend to go from being multifunctional to unifunctional in essence anyway. I think the practicality was a bit different, but
that was the movement towards.
That was the movement.
Well, I think that's a great introduction to the outside of this house, so I think we need to go inside and explore inside. So why don't we go?